The summer of
I wonder what's
1879
waiting
cooked the
down
town
this
of Harrow's
road.
Gulch the way a man might cook a scorpion.
Gotta keep
slow,
moving.
deliberate,
Can't
and without
stay
mercy. By July, the main street had cracked into a mosaic of pale earth and powdered dust that rose with every boot heel and wagon wheel and hot gust of wind that came howling off the Mojave Flats to the south. The buildings along Prater Street leaned into one another like exhausted men at a bar. The sign above the assay office had faded so badly that the word gold was barely legible, bleached to a ghost of itself. Water cost more than whiskey, and whiskey cost more than a man's pride, which in Harrow's Gulch was not saying much at all. But the gold was supposed to make all of that irrelevant. That was what Mayor Aldous Crane told everyone. He told the men who came out of the desert with nothing but blistered hands and hungry eyes. He told the families who arrived in wagons stuffed with furniture and hope and babies who had not yet learned to be afraid of the heat. He told the investors who rode in from Sacramento and Denver and St. Louis on the twice-weekly stagecoach, their suits too fine for the dust and their wallets too thick for their own good. He told them all the same thing, in different words tailored to their particular hunger. Harrow's Gulch sits atop the richest vein of gold this continent has ever produced. The Harrow mine will make us all wealthy men. He said it with the conviction of a preacher and the smile of a card sharp, and people believed him, because people in desperate places are built for believing. Nobody paid much attention to the girl in the shawl. She had no name in the town's collective memory, because towns like Harrow's Gulch do not bother to learn the names of their discards. She was simply there, as much a part of the landscape as the broken water trough outside the livery stable and the dead mesquite tree at the end of Commerce Road that somehow refused to fall over. She sat most mornings against the south wall of the Prater Street General Store, her back against the warm adobe, her knees pulled to her chest, a tin cup on the ground in front of her with a few coins rattling in it when the wind blew. She was 16 years old, though she looked both younger and older depending on the light. Her face was sunbrowned and angular, with dark eyes set wide apart that missed nothing and expressed very little. Her hair was the color of dry creek mud, cut short. She had done it herself with a stolen knife, in the alley behind the hotel, and her clothing beneath the shawl was a man's old work shirt and canvas trousers cut off at the knee, held up by a length of rope. Her feet were wrapped in rags tied with cord. The shawl was the strangest thing about her, and people who noticed her at all usually noticed at first. It was a heavy wool garment, deep brown, fraying at the edges, and wholly inappropriate for the July heat of the Mojave Basin. Even at noon, when the temperature climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit and the very air seemed to shimmer and buckle, she wore it pulled close around her shoulders and crossed over her chest, as though she were braced against a cold wind that only she could feel. Most people assumed she was simple, or feverish, or both. A few of the kinder townswomen had offered to take the shawl and wash it, or burn it and provide something lighter, but the girl had looked at them with those flat, watchful eyes and shaken her head slowly, and something in her expression made them step back and leave her alone. The reverend at the First Methodist Church of Harrow's Gulch occasionally left a biscuit near her cup on Sunday mornings. The barber's wife sometimes brought a cup of water. These were the outer limits of the town's charity. The girl accepted whatever was given with a small nod and ate or drank without haste, and went on watching. Because that was what she did. She watched. Most people, even the ones who noticed her, looked away within a second or two. There is something uncomfortable about the prolonged gaze of a beggar, a mirror quality to it, perhaps, an accusation even when none is intended. In Harrow's Gulch, where every man was convinced he was 3 months away from wealth, the sight of a homeless girl was a thing to be observed and quickly forgotten, like the buzzards circling above the ridge. You registered it and moved on. This meant that within the space of a few seconds, the girl became invisible. And invisible was exactly what she needed to be. Her name was Wren Calloway. She had not spoken it aloud to anyone in Harrow's Gulch, and she did not intend to. Names were a kind of anchor, and she had learned 3 months ago, the same week her father died, the same night she had broken into the mayor's private office and come out with something she was not supposed to have, that anchors in a place like this would only drown you. Her father's name had been Thomas Calloway, and he had been a miner. Not a successful one. He had spent the better part of 20 years following gold the way a lesser man follows a bottle, with great enthusiasm and no particular wisdom. From the played-out streams of Northern California down through Nevada and finally to the Mojave Basin, where a man named Aldous Crane had placed a notice in 6 different newspapers claiming that the Harrow mine had struck a vein of exceptional purity and depth. Thomas Calloway had sold his mule, his pickaxe, and 2 weeks of his time helping a family move furniture to Sacramento, and had arrived in Harrow's Gulch in February of 1879 with $32 and the particular bright-eyed hope of a man who has been disappointed enough times that he has confused desperation for optimism. He had bought a share in the mine. $40, more than he had, so he had borrowed the remaining $8 from a man named Orville Cross who charged 20% interest per month and carried a revolver he was not shy about showing. The share certificate was a beautiful thing, thick cream paper, a border of engraved scrollwork, the seal of the Harrow Consolidated Mining Corporation embossed in gold ink. It promised quarterly dividends beginning in September and full voting rights in the corporation's annual meeting. It was worth exactly nothing. Thomas Calloway had lasted 3 weeks in the mine before his lungs gave out, not from the mine itself, but from the pneumonia he'd contracted sleeping in the tent city that had sprung up on the eastern edge of town where the wind came in hardest off the flats. He was gone by the middle of March, and Wren, who had followed him to Harrow's Gulch because she had no other family and nowhere else to go, had sat beside him in the tent and watched him cough himself into the ground. She had buried him herself, on the hillside above the tent city, because there was no money for the undertaker and she would not ask for charity she had not yet earned. She used a broken board for a marker and carved his name in it with a nail. Then she had gone to see Mayor Aldous Crane. She had not planned to break into his office. She had gone to present herself at the mayor's office on Prater Street, which was a grand name for a 2-room adobe building with a hand-lettered sign and a teenage deputy asleep in a chair outside. She had meant to ask about her father's share certificate, whether there was some provision for the families of shareholders who died, some mechanism of recompense. She had been young enough, and her father's daughter enough, to still half believe in documents and offices and the machinery of legitimate business. The deputy, whose name was Ellis and who was 17 years old and bored and resentful, had looked her over once and told her the mayor wasn't in and wouldn't be back until tomorrow and that she should leave. When she asked about coming back tomorrow, he had looked at her the way boys look at things they don't want to be responsible for, and told her to try the church. She had gone around to the alley behind the building. This was not a plan so much as an instinct. She had grown up in mining camps, in the margins of settlements, and she had learned early that the back of a building was a different country from the front. The back of the mayor's building had a window with a broken latch that swung inward with only a little pressure. She was inside in under a minute. She was not looking for anything specific. She was looking with the undirected hunger of someone who has just lost everything and is still not sure what shape the loss takes. She looked through papers on the desk, found a ledger on the bookshelf behind the mayor's chair, and opened it. The first 20 pages were ordinary enough, lists of expenses, invoices for lumber and hardware and imported furniture. She was about to set it down when the column headers on page 23 stopped her cold. She was not educated in the formal sense. She could read, because her father had taught her, but she had no schooling in accounting or business. Yet even she could understand what she was looking at, because what she was looking at was simple enough, once you understood the pattern. On the left side of the ledger were names. Hundreds of them, in a small, precise hand, last names and initials, followed by dates and amounts. These were investors. Some had put in $20. Some had put in $200. A man identified only as Worthing, P., had put in $15,000 in 2 installments. On the right side of the ledger were 2 columns. One was labeled dividends promised. The other was labeled dividends paid. The second column was blank. Not partially blank. Entirely, completely, unbroken blank, page after page after page. Not a single dividend had ever been paid. There was a third section, at the back of the ledger, that was more carefully hidden, a sheaf of loose pages tucked inside the back cover, folded once. Wren unfolded them and read them by the light of the small window. These were assay reports. Geological surveys. Reports from engineers who had actually descended into the Harrow mine and taken core samples and calculated tonnage and/or grade. The dates spanned from late 1877 to early 1879. There were 6 reports in total. Each one was different in detail and specificity, but they all arrived at the same conclusion in different ways and with different degrees of regret. The Harrow mine contained no commercially viable gold deposit. There had been a surface vein, a modest, surface-level streak of low-grade ore that had run about 40 feet deep before pinching out entirely. By the time Aldous Crane had placed his newspaper notices and sold his first share certificates, the surface vein was already exhausted. The gold that prospective investors were shown, the carefully lit samples in glass cases in the mayor's office, the gleaming dust pressed into demonstration vials, was purchased gold, brought in from a working mine 3 counties north and presented as evidence of Harrow's Gulch's inexhaustible wealth. The mine had been empty for over a year. Everything, the share certificates, the quarterly dividend promises, the talk of the richest vein this continent had ever produced, was a fiction. The money coming in from new investors was being used to pay the operating costs of maintaining the illusion, the miners who were employed largely as props, the assay office with its rigged scales, the foreman who filed fraudulent production reports. And the rest went somewhere else, into whose pocket was not entirely clear from the ledger alone, but the numbers were not subtle. Wren had stood in the mayor's back office for a long time after she finished reading, in the specific silence of someone whose worst suspicions have been confirmed beyond the reach of argument. Then she had folded the loose papers, closed the ledger, tucked the entire thing under her arm, and climbed back out the window. She had wrapped it in her mother's shawl, the only thing she had left of her mother, who had died when Wren was 6, and she had not taken it off since. 3 months had passed since then. 3 months was long enough to learn the rhythms of Harrow's Gulch the way a trapper learns a river, where the current runs fast, where the eddies collect, which bends hide what beneath the surface. Wren had spent those months sitting in plain sight, and what she had gathered was considerable. She knew, for instance, that Mayor Crane met with investors in his office every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon between 2 and 4 o'clock, and that his secretary, a thin, nervous young man named Hobart, was always sent to the hotel across the street during these meetings on the pretext of collecting the mayor's dry cleaning. She knew that the meetings were never fewer than 40 minutes and never longer than 2 hours. She had begun keeping notes on the back of a piece of brown paper she'd found, scratching with a nail dipped in a mixture of ash and water she kept in a small tin. She knew that Sheriff Clay Mabry was not exactly corrupt, not in the bought-and-sold sense, but that he was incurious in the way of a man who has achieved a comfortable arrangement and is not interested in asking questions that might disturb it. He received a monthly envelope from the mayor's office, delivered by Hobart on the last Friday of every month. He had told himself, Wren suspected, that it was a form of civic stipend. He had not examined the ledger she had taken, or he would have found his initials in the left-hand column too, with a date and an investment amount she had a feeling he'd rather forget. She knew that Foreman Dale Whitmore, who ran the mine operations, drank every evening at the Gold Pan Saloon starting at 6 o'clock and went home at 9 unless there was a card game, in which case it might be midnight. She knew that when Whitmore drank past his 3rd glass of rye, he became expansive and philosophical about the general dishonesty of the world, which she took to be a form of confession without a confessor. She knew that a man named Silas Pruitt, who was the head of the Harrow Gulch Citizens Investment Collective, a cheerful name for the organized body of local shareholders, had begun writing letters. She knew this because Pruitt lived in a room above the hardware store and had a habit of sitting at his window in the evenings to write by lamplight, and his window faced the alley where Wren sometimes slept when the weather permitted. She could not read the letters at that distance, but she could read the anxiety in his posture, the way he would write for a while, stop, rub his face, look out at the dark street, and then crumple the page and start over. She knew that 2 men from San Francisco had arrived 3 weeks ago, stayed at the Harrow Hotel for 4 nights, visited the mine in the company of the mayor, and left without buying shares. She had watched from her spot against the general store as they climbed into the stage back north, and the taller one had said something to the shorter one as they waited for the driver to secure the luggage, and though she could not hear the words from 30 feet away, she could read the shorter man's expression clearly enough, disbelief giving way to something colder and more resolved. She had noted all of this. added it to the growing record on the back of her brown paper, which she kept folded inside the shawl alongside the ledger, pressed against her ribs where the warmth of her body kept the papers from becoming brittle in the dry air. What she had not decided was what to do with any of it. This was the problem she turned over each night, lying in the alley or under the overhang of the livery stable roof, staring up at the enormous and indifferent desert stars. The ledger was damning. The surveys were conclusive. The pattern of Crane's fraud was, to her eyes, unmistakable. But she was a homeless girl of 16 in a town where the mayor was the most powerful man for 30 miles in every direction, the sheriff was in some degree of debt or complicity, and no one had ever looked at her long enough to see a person, let alone a witness. She could go to the sheriff. She ran this thought out to its natural conclusion and found nothing encouraging at the end of it. Mabry would look at the ledger. He would recognize his own name. He would see a homeless girl who had clearly broken into the mayor's private office and stolen property. The outcome of that scenario was not difficult to predict. She could attempt to leave, take the ledger north to Sacramento or Denver, find a newspaper office or a federal marshal or some authority with both the interest and the jurisdiction to act. She had thought about this often. The problem was that she had no money for the stage fare, no horse, and no certainty that she would survive the walk across the flats. She had tried to make it to the next settlement on foot, once, in April, and had come back after 6 miles when the heat had nearly done what the desert's reputation promised. She needed money, or a horse, or an ally. Preferably all three. What she had was time, and the ability to disappear in plain sight. So she watched, and she waited, and she gathered, and she tried to understand the shape of the trap she was in. The man arrived on the Thursday stage in the first week of July. He was not the kind of man who usually came to Harrow's Gulch. He was not the desperate kind, broad-shouldered and hollow-eyed, smelling of too many miles in the sun. He was not the investor kind either, too plainly dressed for money, wearing a good but practical linen suit the color of old bone, a flat-brimmed hat of woven straw, and boots that had seen significant use without being neglected. He was somewhere between 30 and 35, dark-haired and narrow-faced, with the kind of watchful composure that Wren recognized, because it was the same quality she cultivated in herself. He carried a leather satchel and a small traveling case, and when the stage stopped in front of the Harrow Hotel, he stepped down without hurry and stood for a moment in the street, turning his head slowly to take in the buildings, the heat shimmer, the mine operations visible on the bluff above the north end of town. He had a small notebook, the kind reporters and railroad surveyors carry, with a stiff board cover, and he made a brief note in it before going inside. Wren watched all of this from her spot against the general store, which was diagonally across the street from the hotel. She watched him check in. She watched the desk clerk, a man named Finch who was Crane's cousin by marriage and reported everything interesting to the mayor within the hour, lean forward with the particular alert posture of a man receiving a name that meant something. She watched the stranger go upstairs. 40 minutes later, she watched Hobart hurry from the mayor's office in the direction of the hotel. She was on her feet before she had consciously decided to move, shuffling along the east side of Prater Street with the slow, aimless gait she had perfected over 3 months, the walk of someone going nowhere in particular, which was the ideal cover for someone going somewhere very specific. She reached the hotel's front porch as Hobart was coming back out, tucking something into his vest pocket. She sat down on the edge of the porch steps, set her tin cup on the bottom step, and became furniture. Through the hotel's open front window, it was too hot to close anything. She heard Finch at the front desk say to his assistant, "You tell anyone he's here. I'll make sure the sheriff hears about what you did last Christmas." The assistant said nothing. Wren picked up her cup and moved on. She circled the block. She was very good at circling blocks unobtrusively, and came around to the alley behind the hotel, where the kitchen had a propped-open door for ventilation. She sat against the wall beside the door, in the narrow stripe of shade it provided, and waited. An hour passed. 2. She could hear the kitchen sounds, pots, the cook's occasional cursing, the specific clink of plates being stacked. Then, at around 5 in the afternoon, she heard footsteps on the back stairs of the hotel, the exterior wooden stairs that descended to the alley. The stranger came down carrying his notebook and nothing else. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looked at the alley in both directions, and then looked at Wren. She looked back at him. Most people looked away. He did not. "Hot day to be wearing a shawl," he said. "Hot day to be wearing a linen jacket," she replied. It was the first complete sentence she had spoken aloud in 3 days, and her voice came out a little rougher than she expected. He had the grace not to show surprise. He nodded once, as though she had confirmed something he suspected, and leaned against the opposite wall of the alley with his arms crossed. "You've been sitting out front of that general store all day," he said. It was not a question. "Most days," she said. "You see everything that comes and goes on this street." "Most things," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He had a quality of stillness that she trusted, not the stillness of danger, but the stillness of someone who had learned to wait. She had seen the same quality in her father, in the very early days before the disappointments had made him fidgety and desperate. It was the stillness of someone who listened more than they spoke. "My name is Edmund Parr," he said. "I write for the Western Commercial Review. Financial reporting, mostly. Mining investment, land speculation, that kind of thing. I've been tracking a number of gold mining ventures across the Southern Territories for a piece on investment fraud." Wren said nothing. She let him continue. "I came to Harrow's Gulch because of some correspondence I received from a man named Silas Pruitt, who writes letters at his window at night," Wren said. "First floor, above the hardware store. Has been for about 3 weeks. Never finishes them." Edmund Parr was quiet for a moment. Then, very carefully, he opened his notebook and wrote something down. "He reached me through a colleague in Denver," Parr said. "The letter that made it through said he had concerns about the mine's production reports. That the numbers being presented to investors didn't match what he could see happening at the mine with his own eyes." "He's right," Wren said. Another silence. "How do you know that?" he said. She studied him for a long moment. She had been waiting for someone, the right someone, for 3 months. She had not been sure, when she tried to picture this person, what they would look like. She had not expected a financial reporter from the Western Commercial Review. But then, she had not expected a lot of things. "If I show you something," she said slowly, "and you write about it, and it gets printed, what happens to the people who were defrauded?" "Depends on the evidence," he said. "If the fraud is demonstrable and the evidence holds up, which it needs to, I'm not interested in printing accusations without proof, then there are legal remedies. Federal law covers securities fraud. There are cases where the courts have ordered restitution. The investors get some portion of their money back, depending on what assets can be recovered. What about the people who can't be found? Who died before it comes out?" Something in his expression shifted. Became more careful. "What's your name?" he said. She had not said it aloud in 3 months. It came out steadier than she expected. "Wren Calloway. My father was Thomas Calloway. He bought a share in the Harrow mine in February and died in March without ever seeing a cent of return. He borrowed $8 at 20% monthly interest to make the purchase, and the debt is probably still accruing to his estate, which is me." Edmund Parr closed his notebook. He put it in his jacket pocket. He looked at her with the particular attention of a man who has just understood that he is in the middle of a more important conversation than he realized. "What do you have?" he said. She reached inside the shawl and drew it out, first the folded brown paper with her 3 months of notes scratched in ash water ink, then the sheaf of geological surveys, then the ledger itself, its worn leather cover darkened with sweat and heat. She set it on the ground between them. "Everything," she said. They met twice more in the alley behind the hotel over the next 2 days, and each time Wren brought new information. She told him about the Tuesday and Thursday meetings. She told him about Hobart's errands and what they concealed. She told him about Whitmore's drinking and the nature of his expansive late-night philosophizing. She recited from memory the names and amounts from the ledger's left-hand column. She had memorized the first 40 entries, the largest investors, and she read him passages from the geological surveys while he wrote rapidly in his notebook. She told him about the San Francisco men who had left without buying shares and with that cold, resolved expression on the shorter man's face. She told him about Silas Pruitt's unfinished letters. She told him about the sheriff's monthly envelope. She told him almost everything. What she did not tell him, not yet, was the thing she had discovered in her last week of watching, the detail that changed the shape of the fraud from merely criminal to something more urgent and dangerous. 3 weeks ago, she had been sitting in her usual spot on the morning when Crane had walked past with a man she had not seen before, a thick-set man in a gray suit with a silver watch chain, who moved with the unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. They had not been speaking loudly. But Wren had learned, in 3 months, to go very still in a way that turned her hearing outward, and she caught enough. The man's name was Garfield. He was an associate from San Francisco, not the pair who had left disappointed, but someone different, someone senior. He had used a phrase that stayed with her: "We cannot sustain the distribution past October without fresh capital." And Crane had answered with something about a final round and a consolidation event, and then they had moved out of range. She had not fully understood this at the time. But since meeting Parr and hearing him explain, in plain terms, the mechanics of what Crane was running, a Ponzi scheme, he called it, a carousel of fraud where new investors' money paid the costs of maintaining the illusion for old investors while the organizers skimmed relentlessly from the top, she had begun to understand what final round and consolidation event meant. They were planning to take one last enormous infusion of capital and disappear. She understood now why the scheme had an expiration date. The original mine surveys were almost 3 years old. The geological reality of the Harrow mine could not be hidden forever. There were only so many falsified production reports, only so many carefully staged or samples, only so many diversions and explanations and reframings before the emptiness of the bluff became undeniable. Crane knew this. He had always known it. The whole enterprise had been designed from the start with an exit in mind, not as a permanent fixture. October was 3 months away. There was, she suspected, a significant investment presentation planned, the final round, and then Crane and the man Garfield and whoever else was in on the inner mechanics would be gone, and the investors of Harrow's Gulch would be left holding beautifully engraved pieces of worthless paper. On the third night of her meetings with Parr, she told him this. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. "You've known about this for 3 months, he said at last. Not with accusation exactly, but with the careful tone of a man working out the geometry of a situation. "Yes. Why didn't you go to the authorities?" She looked at him with a steadiness that made him shift slightly against the wall. "Which authorities?" she said. "The sheriff whose initials are in the investment ledger. The federal marshal who would need to be notified by the sheriff. The judge in the nearest town who plays cards with Crane on Friday nights. I've verified this from 3 separate conversations I've overheard in the past 2 months." She paused. "Or should I have walked 40 miles across the Mojave Flats in April with no money and no horse and a ledger that would be visible cause for a search if anyone from this town caught me on the road?" Parr was quiet again. "What do you need from me?" he said. "I need you to get the ledger and the surveys out of this town, to somewhere they can be authenticated and acted on before October. I need you to write the story and publish it before Crane has time to disappear. And I need someone, a lawyer, a marshal, someone with the authority to actually do something, to come here and arrest Aldous Crane and Dale Whitmore and the man named Garfield before they get on a stage north with whatever cash they've been skimming." "That's a great deal to organize," Parr said. "Yes," she agreed. "It's why I've been waiting for someone who could help me organize it." He looked at her differently then, or perhaps he was finally seeing what had always been there, a thing that is easy to overlook when you are looking at a shawl in the July heat and not looking at the eyes above it. He saw a girl who had been carrying the weight of 50-plus families' life savings under her arm for 3 months, and had not collapsed under it, and had not been broken by it, and had in fact used those 3 months to build something careful and meticulous and potentially powerful enough to actually work. "I need to telegraph my editor in San Francisco," he said, "and contact a federal associate of mine who covers mining fraud. That's going to require using the telegraph office, which means my communications go through the operator, who is Crane's wife's brother, Wren said. Crane reads everything that goes through the office. I've seen Hobart at the telegraph office after hours, when the operator is closed, at least 4 times in the past 2 months. So the telegraph is compromised. Yes. Then someone needs to carry a letter north by the stage. Someone who isn't you, she said. You're already being watched. Hobart came to the hotel within an hour of you arriving. They know who you are. Parr looked at her. Who, then, he said. She thought of Silas Pruitt, writing unsent letters at his window. She thought of what it must feel like to suspect the worst and have no one to say it to write and rewrite and crumple the pages, night after night, because there was nowhere safe to send the truth. There's a man who might be willing, she said. But I'll need to talk to him first. Silas Pruitt was 51 years old and had the defeated posture of a man who had been right about something he very much wished he'd been wrong about. He had come to Harrow's Gulch in the autumn of 1877, one of the early investors, full of the particular optimism of a man who had done his research and felt justified in his enthusiasm. He had been a bookkeeper for 20 years, good with numbers, careful with evidence, the sort of man who did not commit to a course of action without examining it from multiple angles first. He had read Crane's prospectus with a bookkeeper's eye and found it persuasive, and then he had come out to Harrow's Gulch and seen the mine and the assay office and the carefully lit display cases with their gleaming samples, and he had found it more persuasive still. He had invested $800. He had convinced 3 friends to invest as well. This was the thing that woke him at 3 in the morning, that drove him to the window with pen and paper, that made him write and rewrite and crumple, not just his own $800. But the 3 friends who had trusted his recommendation. People who could not afford to lose that money. People who had used their savings, or borrowed, or sold something they shouldn't have. He had begun to suspect the truth in February, a slight inconsistency in the production figures that he, as a former bookkeeper, had noticed and written down. By April, the inconsistencies had accumulated into a pattern he could not explain away. By June, he was writing letters he couldn't send to people he couldn't reach, because he had no proof and no authority and no clear pathway through the tangle of relationships and dependencies and implied threats that made up the political ecology of Harrow's Gulch. He sat at his window on Friday evening with a fresh page in front of him when he heard a sound from the alley below, the scuff of a foot on gravel, deliberate and quiet. He looked down. The girl in the shawl was standing in the alley, looking up at him. He had seen her before, everyone had seen her, in the way that you see a fence post or a particular crack in the sidewalk. He had given her a coin once, in May, without thinking much about it. But now she was looking up at him with those flat, watchful eyes, and she was holding something up for him to see, a folded piece of paper, and below it, the worn cover of a ledger. He went downstairs. They talked in the alley for an hour and a half, standing in the dark with Wren's back to the wall and Pruitt's head bent toward her because she spoke quietly and he had to lean into ear. She told him about the ledger and the surveys. She read him the entry for his name from memory, Pruitt, S.W., $800, dated October 4th, 1877. She told him about Parr and the Western Commercial Review and what she needed in terms of a career and a timeline. At some point during the conversation, Pruitt put his hand over his eyes for a moment. Just for a moment. Then he straightened and said, "The 3 friends I brought in, what are their initials?" She told him. They were all there. "I'll carry whatever needs carrying," he said. "When?" "Monday's stage," she said. "That gives us Sunday to prepare." "What am I carrying?" "Letters. Copies I've made of the most critical survey entries and ledger pages. I've been copying them for the past 2 days, while you were writing." She pulled out the folded brown paper and showed him. Both sides were now covered in her careful, close-written hand, every word squeezed small to fit. "Parr will have his letters ready, one to his editor, one to his federal contact. And you'll have a letter to a lawyer in Sacramento that Parr knows, who has handled federal fraud referrals before." She paused. "The original ledger stays here with me. I need it for what happens after." What happens after? Pruitt said. The stage will be 6 days to Sacramento, she said. 2 days for Parr's contact to arrange a federal marshal. 4 days back, minimum, probably more like a week. That's 13 to 15 days before anything official arrives. We need to keep Crane from discovering that anything is moving against him for 2 weeks. Can you do that? She looked at him steadily. I've done it for 3 months, she said. 2 more weeks is nothing. Monday came and went without incident. Pruitt boarded the northbound stage with the letters distributed between his coat pocket and his traveling bag, and departed Harrow's Gulch on the pretext of visiting a cousin in Bakersfield, a cousin who did in fact exist, which was convenient. Crane, if he noticed the departure at all, would have no reason for concern. Parr remained in Harrow's Gulch, moving carefully. He visited the mine on a scheduled tour with 3 other prospective investors, a performance Crane was apparently still confident enough to offer, and took notes in his small stiff-covered book. He asked questions that were slightly more pointed than a genuine investor would ask, but not so pointed as to alarm. He presented himself as a man doing thorough due diligence, and Crane played the part of a man with nothing to hide, which he did with considerable skill. Wren watched Parr's tour from her spot against the general store, saw when he came back down the hill, tracked his return to the hotel. She watched Crane watch Parr, watched the mayor's gaze follow the reporter across the street with an expression that was professionally pleasant and professionally nothing else. She had spent enough time studying Crane's face from a distance to have learned its grammar, and what she read there was the watchfulness of a man who considered every stranger a variable to be assessed and managed. She had to manage her own fear in those 14 days. It was not a dramatic fear, she had lived with it long enough that it had lost its sharp edges, but it was persistent, a low background presence like the heat shimmer on the desert floor. She was carrying something that could ruin a man who had both the motive and the resources to make a problem disappear. She was sleeping in alleys and under overhangs with a stolen ledger pressed against her ribs, in a town where the sheriff was compromised and the telegrapher was the mayor's brother-in-law. If anyone searched her, if Crane or Whitmore or one of the men who worked for them decided that the girl in the shawl was worth a closer look, it would be over. So she was careful. Not paranoid, because paranoia makes you visible. Careful. She varied her sleeping spots every night. She moved between 4 locations: the alley behind the hotel, the space under the livery stable overhang, a dry irrigation ditch at the edge of the tent city, and the small gap between the bakery and the hardware store that was only large enough for someone of her size. She varied the times at which she appeared in her usual spot on Prater Street, staying sometimes an hour, sometimes 3. She changed nothing that was observable from the outside, but kept nothing predictable from the inside. She checked the ledger each morning. It was always there, pressed flat inside the shawl. She did not take it out in daylight. On the 6th day, something changed. She was in her spot when Crane came out of his office and stood on the step, looking up and down Prater Street with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the professional composure, but something underneath it, something tight and irritable, like a man who has received news he doesn't like and is deciding what to do about it. He looked toward the hotel. He looked toward the general store, past her, through her, without seeing her. He went back inside. An hour later, Hobart came out and walked quickly in the direction of the Gold Pan Saloon. He returned 20 minutes later with Whitmore, the mine foreman, still tucking in his shirt and looking resentful at being pulled from his afternoon drink. They went inside together. That evening, she positioned herself near the mayor's building on the pretense of sitting against the mercantile wall 3 doors down, close enough to hear raised voices if they came through the window, which Crane sometimes left open in the evenings when the heat of the day had baked into the adobe and nothing inside was moving. She heard Whitmore's voice first, a low, growling complaint she could not make out, and then Crane's voice, precise and cold. "Didn't say lost, I said unavailable. There's a difference. Find out who's been in that office." She did not move. She did not accelerate her breathing or change her posture. She sat against the mercantile wall with her knees to her chest and her cup in front of her, and she became, as she had trained herself to become, completely, absolutely, unremarkably present, A piece of the town's ordinary furniture, no more worth attending to than the broken trough outside the livery stable. He knew the ledger was gone. He had apparently either known for a while and not acted on it, or had just discovered it. Either way, it changed the timeline. She made a decision. She found Parr that evening in the alley behind the hotel. "He knows," she said. Parr absorbed this without visible alarm. "When did he find out? Today or recently?" "He's not sure who took it. He told Whitmore to find out who'd been in the office. That could mean he has a list of suspects. Or it could mean he's fishing. Can he connect it to you?" She thought about this carefully. "Not directly. No one saw me go in. He may assume it was an investor. Pruitt is the obvious candidate, given that Pruitt has been asking inconvenient questions. With Pruitt gone, that theory becomes more attractive. So Pruitt may be in danger when he returns." "Pruitt was always going to be in danger," she said. "So is everyone who invested in this mine if Crane decides to accelerate his exit. October was the deadline. If he thinks someone is moving against him, he may move the timetable forward." She paused. "We need the federal marshal to be here in 10 days, not 15. "I can't make the stage go faster," Parr said. "No," she agreed. "But you can be ready to act the moment it arrives. And I can make sure that what happens in the meantime is documented." She told him then about the brown paper, the notes she had been keeping for 3 months, now supplemented with the new observations from the past week. She went through it systematically: dates, names, amounts, conversations, behavioral patterns. The pattern of fraud was laid out with a completeness that surprised him. She could see that. He read through everything twice, asking occasional questions, writing rapidly. "This is extraordinary," he said at one point. "It's 3 months of sitting still," she said. It was Whitmore who almost unraveled it. On the 10th day, the foreman found her. She did not see it coming, which was the thing that frightened her most about it afterward, the gap in the pattern she had not anticipated. She was in her spot on Prater Street, mid-morning, the day already building toward its full brutal heat, when the shadow fell across her and she looked up to find Whitmore standing over her, big and broad and smelling of last night's rye and this morning's sweat, with the slightly unfocused look of a man who has been given a task he doesn't entirely understand and is approaching it with more force than precision. "You," he said. "Girl. Stand up." She had a fraction of a second before her body made the choice for her, and the choice was stillness. Not the frozen stillness of panic, but the deliberate stillness of someone who has thought about this moment and what it requires. She stood up slowly, as someone who has nothing urgent would stand, and looked at him with the flat, empty eyes she kept for occasions like this, or had prepared for occasions like this, though this was the first time it had actually come. "Someone told me," Whitmore said, "that you're always out here. That you see everything. That you know who comes and goes." He had not been told to do anything specific, she realized. He had been told to find out who had been in the office, and he had done what men of his particular type do when given an ambiguous task. He had worked outward from the most obvious starting point. The girl who sees everything. The town's living surveillance camera. He had reasoned backward to her in the way that a man does who is not subtle but is not entirely stupid either. "I sit here," she said. Her voice was flat and simple. "People walk by. Did you see anyone go around the back of the mayor's office? In the past few months? Anyone you didn't recognize?" She looked at him for a moment, then looked away in the direction of the general store's doorway, in the exact way of someone remembering something unremarkable. "There's always people going around back of buildings," she said. "Deliveries. Sometimes the Hobart man. Sometimes others." "What others?" She described, in slow and apparently effortful detail, 3 entirely fictional individuals: a man with a gray hat and a limp, who came around back of the office in April, a woman she didn't recognize, in May, someone who might have been a miner, with dust on his boots. She gave each one a few specific but ultimately useless details, not so vague as to seem made up, not so specific as to be checkable. She delivered these descriptions in the tone of someone trying to be helpful without being entirely sure if they are. Whitmore listened. He did not write anything down, which was consistent with a man who had been told to ask around, not to conduct a formal investigation. "Anything else?" he said. "There was a man," she said, as an afterthought, in the voice of someone remembering something almost forgotten, couple months back. "Nice suit. Went around back and then came out again real fast, like he'd changed his mind about something. Never saw him again after that." "What did he look like?" She described someone who sounded vaguely like the man Garfield in his gray suit, but less specifically, with more uncertainty, with the particular inexactness of someone who sees many strangers and doesn't pay close attention. She described a man who could have been anyone. Whitmore grunted. He looked at her for a moment with the unfocused appraisal of someone who cannot quite decide if they are being given something useful or strung along, and in that particular ambiguity, she found her safety. She was too clearly a beggar girl recalling glimpses of strangers. She was too visible in her invisibility. He filed her away as a marginal source and moved on. But when he walked away, she sat back down against the wall of the general store and pressed her hand flat against her ribs, against the ledger beneath the shawl, and breathed for a long minute before she trusted herself to look normal again. That was the closest it came. Pruitt returned on the northbound stage on the 12th day. He came back alone, which was what they had agreed. The federal contact would travel separately, with documentation that establishing the chain of contact with a known correspondent would not compromise. But Pruitt was back, and that meant the letters had reached their destinations, and that meant the machinery was moving. She saw him get off the stage. He was careful not to look in her direction. They had agreed on this too. He collected his bag and went directly to his room above the hardware store. Within 20 minutes she saw his light come on in the window. 2 hours later, he came to the window and looked out at the alley. She was not there. She was across the street in the shadow of the dry mesquite tree at the end of Commerce Road, watching him look out the window, watching Crane's office, watching the street. She saw Crane come out at around 4 in the afternoon. He was carrying a traveling bag. This had not been part of the expected pattern. She felt the familiar coldness of a variable moving unexpectedly and tracked it forward. A traveling bag meant either a business meeting in the next settlement or a departure. The southbound stage ran on Tuesdays. Today was Thursday. He was not going by stage. She watched him cross the street to the livery stable. She was on her feet. She crossed Commerce Road and came around the back of the livery stable, through the gap in the fence she had identified and mapped in month 1 of her residence in Harrow's Gulch. She came in through the back of the stable and crouched behind a stack of hay bales, close enough to hear. Crane was talking to the stable hand. He wanted his horse and a second horse, and he wanted both saddled within the hour. He was asking about road conditions northward. North. Not south, not the Mojave Flats. North, toward Bakersfield and then Sacramento. She did not wait to hear more. She backed out of the stable and moved quickly, not running, because running draws eyes, but the fastest walk she could manage without looking like flight. She went to the alley behind the hotel and threw a pebble at Parr's window. He appeared within 30 seconds. "He's leaving," she said. "North, on horseback, within the hour. He's taking 2 horses, a rider and a pack horse, which means he's carrying weight. Cash, probably. Documents. Whatever he's been skimming." Parr's face went through several things in quick succession. "The marshal isn't here yet," he said. "No," she said. "The marshal is 3 days away at minimum. Crane knows about the ledger. He may have intercepted something from Pruitt's departure or done his own accounting and realized the timeline has moved. He's cutting his losses and running." She paused. "We can't let him get to Sacramento before the marshal gets here. If he reaches the city with whatever funds he's carrying, he can disappear. What do you suggest?" She had been thinking about this for the past 10 minutes, since the moment she saw the traveling bag. She had thought about it the way she thought about everything, systematically, mapping the available pieces and the constraints between them, looking for the configuration that worked. Pruitt, she said. He has to go to the sheriff. Parr stared at her. The sheriff is compromised. Yes. But Pruitt doesn't know that I know that, officially. And more importantly, the sheriff knows he's in the ledger. If Pruitt goes to the sheriff with a partial account of what he suspects, and makes clear that he has written to federal authorities and that a federal marshal is en route, the sheriff has a decision to make. He can continue to protect Crane and be found complicit in the full fraud when the marshal arrives, or he can demonstrate good faith by detaining Crane long enough for the federal authority to arrive and take jurisdiction. You're betting that the sheriff will choose self-preservation over loyalty. I'm betting that the sheriff never had loyalty to Crane specifically, she said. He had loyalty to his own arrangement, which was comfortable but not worth prison. Crane fleeing with the money ends the arrangement anyway. The sheriff gets nothing by letting him go, and everything to lose when the marshal arrives and finds out he knew. Parr thought about this for exactly 3 seconds. All right, he said. I'll go with Pruitt. No, she said. You stay here. I need you here when the marshal arrives. You're the record, you're the chain of evidence from me to publication. You can't be associated with what happens in the next hour because you're a journalist and you need to be a witness, not a participant. She had thought about this too. Pruitt goes alone. He's a local man, an investor, someone the sheriff can take seriously. He goes with the genuine suspicion he has, which is real, and leaves out the parts that could raise questions about the ledger's provenance. There was a brief silence. And you? Parr said. I go where I can watch, she said. Same as always. Pruitt was at the sheriff's office within 10 minutes. Wren could not hear the conversation. The office was on the other side of Prater Street with the shutters half closed in the afternoon heat. She watched through the distorting shimmer of the heat haze from her position against the mercantile wall, and she read what she could from posture and movement and the expressions of people coming and going. Pruitt went in at 4:27 by the clock above the assay office. He came out 14 minutes later, and with him came Sheriff Clay Mabry, a large, graying man who moved with the habitual slowness of someone who has spent a long career not moving unnecessarily. He was moving purposefully now. He was wearing his badge and his holster. They walked toward the livery stable. Wren folded herself against the mercantile wall and became invisible, which meant she watched the confrontation through the gap between 2 boards and the stable's exterior fence, the same gap she had used to enter from the back, now used for observation from the front. Crane was at the stable entrance when Mabry arrived. His horses were saddled. One saddlebag was visibly heavy. The conversation between Crane and Mabry was short and largely inaudible, but the shape of it was clear from what she could observe. Crane began with the professional composure, but it had cracks in it now, hairline fractures she had not seen before, because before now he had not been caught mid-flight. Mabry was doing the thing a careful sheriff does when he is frightened but not yet committed. He was asking questions and listening very closely to the answers and calculating. At some point, Mabry put his hand on the heavy saddlebag. Crane said something sharp. Mabry said something quiet and even. Crane's composure finally and visibly failed, not dramatically, not in the way of fiction, but in the specific, almost invisible way of a man who is used to being in control discovering that the control has slipped from his hands so gradually that by the time he noticed, it was already gone. Mabry led both horses back into the stable. He said something to the stable hand. He said something else to Crane. Crane walked with him back toward the sheriff's office, not in handcuffs, not quite under arrest in any formal sense, but escorted in the direction he clearly had not wanted to go. Pruitt watched from across the street. Then he looked in Wren's direction, not directly at her, because she had told him never to look directly at her in public, but toward the mercantile wall, in the general vicinity. She was already gone. The federal marshal arrived on the 16th day with a deputy and a lawyer named Beaumont who worked for the Justice Department out of San Francisco. They came on the Tuesday stage, which caused a notable stir on Prater Street. Crane had been held, technically as a material witness in an ongoing investigation, a formulation Mabry had managed to sustain with impressive flexibility for 9 days, given that the investigation had not yet formally begun. Whitmore had not run, either he did not know enough to know he should, or he had calculated that running would constitute a more obvious admission of guilt than staying and hoping. The man Garfield was not in Harrow's Gulch and had not been since his visit in mid-June, which was a problem for later. Parr met the marshal, a square-shouldered Virginian named Donahue, at the hotel and gave him 3 hours of conversation and 2 notebooks worth of documentation before bringing him to meet Wren. She was in the alley behind the hotel. She was carrying the ledger. She handed it to Marshal Donahue with both hands and a directness that he was visibly unprepared for. He looked at the ledger, looked at the shawl she was still wearing in the July heat, and then looked at Parr, who said simply, "This is the primary source." "How old are you?" Donahue said to her. 16, she said. "And a half." This was in the mayor's private office. "Yes." "And you took it?" "Yes." Donahue looked at her for a long moment. He was the 3rd or 4th person in her life who had looked at her long enough to actually see her, and she met his gaze without difficulty. "That complicates the chain of evidence," he said. "The geological surveys were filed with the corporation's own records," she said. "They're copies of documents Crane commissioned and paid for with investor funds. They're corporate property, not private property, and the corporation's shareholders are the investors, not the officer who committed fraud against them. My father was a shareholder." She paused. "I've had 3 months to think through the legal questions. I'm open to a better argument if you have one." Donahue looked at Parr again. "She's been doing this for 3 months, Parr said, with a quality in his voice that was not quite admiration but was something close to it. "Largely alone." Donahue turned back to Wren. He held up the ledger. "I'll need you to walk me through this. Every entry, every notation, everything you understand about how this was structured." "Of course," she said. "I also have notes on 3 months of observations, behavioral patterns, meeting schedules, the courier arrangement between the mayor's office and the telegraph, the monthly payments to the sheriff, which I can provide as supplementary documentation." The marshal blinked. "All of it," she said, "on the back of a piece of brown paper and ash water ink, which is admittedly not the ideal archival medium, but it's what I had." Aldous Crane was formally arrested on a Tuesday morning in late July, which was the 2nd hottest day of the year in Harrow's Gulch, and the heat gave the proceedings a slightly unreal quality, as if the whole affair were taking place in the distorting shimmer of a fever. Dale Whitmore was arrested the same afternoon. He cooperated extensively and immediately, in the manner of a man who had been waiting, in some dim recess of his conscience, for the opportunity to unburden himself. Sheriff Mabry was not arrested, but he resigned from his post that evening and spent the following weeks producing a written account of every interaction he had had with Crane's organization, which proved more useful than anyone had expected. The man named Garfield was found in Sacramento 6 weeks later, which Wren did not witness personally but read about in a copy of the Western Commercial Review that Parr sent her. The article was 12 pages long, and it began, "The fraud at Harrow's Gulch was not exposed by a lawyer, a marshal, or a financial investigator, but by a 16-year-old girl who slept in alleys and was invisible to everyone around her, and who used that invisibility more skillfully than most professionals use an office and a salary." She read this sitting on the steps of the boarding house where she had been given a room, paid for from an emergency fund established by the federal proceeding, and she read it twice, slowly, then folded it and held it in her lap. The boarding house was on Prater Street, 3 doors down from the general store. She had not yet decided what came next. There was a question of restitution for the investors, which Beaumont the federal lawyer had said was possible but would take time and would not result in full recovery of invested amounts. There was a question of what happened to the town, now that the mine was officially declared empty and the economic rationale for Harrow's Gulch's existence had collapsed. Some families would leave. Others, she suspected, would stay and find other things to sustain them. This was, she had observed, what people in difficult places do. They adapt. There was a question of what happened to her. Parr had offered to help her find a position in Sacramento, a school, or a respectable household, or an introduction to someone who might value a person with her observational skills and her capacity for patient, systematic work. He had made the offer carefully, not as charity but as a practical suggestion from someone who had seen her in action and could make an informed recommendation. She had not said yes or no. She was not in a hurry. She was good at waiting. What she knew, sitting on the boarding house steps in the July heat with the article in her lap, was this: she had come to Harrow's Gulch as a girl following her father to a place that turned out to be built on a lie. She had lost him there, and then she had lost what little safety she'd had, and she had been reduced to the outer edges of the town's awareness, where the invisible people live. And from that place, from the margin, from the alley, from the space behind the fence boards and below the window and against the mercantile wall, she had seen the lie clearly, and she had held the proof of it against her ribs for 3 months, and she had not let go. The shawl was on her shoulders still. She had washed it, finally. She had done this the first evening in the boarding house, carefully, in a bucket of water, and hung it to dry on the window sill. And when it came in the next morning it was lighter and less darkened with accumulated weeks, but recognizably itself, the brown wool still dense enough to hold a ledger, or letters, or whatever needed holding. It was her mother's, and it was practical, and it was the only thing she intended to keep from these months unchanged. Everything else could be new. Harrow's Gulch did not forget her, exactly. What it did was more complicated than forgetting. The town told the story the way small towns tell difficult stories, with editing, with compression, with the selective amnesia that makes a community bearable to itself. The version that survived told of a brave girl who had exposed the mayor's fraud, which was true as far as it went. The version omitted the 3 months of invisibility, the alleys, the ash water ink, the careful architecture of watching and waiting that made the brave moment possible. It made it cleaner: a girl, a ledger, a confrontation. Silas Pruitt, who knew better, was interviewed by Parr for a follow-up article the following year, and he said something that made it into print and that Wren read later in Sacramento, where she was by then working as a junior research correspondent for the Western Commercial Review, the youngest such correspondent the publication had ever employed, and the only one who had begun their career lying in an alley with a stolen ledger pressed against their ribs. Pruitt said, "People always want to know where she hid it. They assume some clever hiding place, a loose floorboard or a hollowed-out Bible. But she never hid it at all. She carried it with her, in plain sight, wrapped in a shawl that everyone could see. No one thought to look because no one thought to look at her. She survived not by being invisible, but by making herself into something people had already decided wasn't worth seeing. And then she used the decision against everyone who had made it. The broken water trough outside the livery stable was repaired, eventually. The dry mesquite tree at the end of Commerce Road finally fell in the winter of 1880. The general store changed owners and got a new sign. The space beside the south wall, where a girl in a shawl had sat for 3 months and watched the entire machinery of a town's deception turn in plain sight, that space remained as it had always been. Just an empty stretch of adobe wall, warm in the sun, catching and holding the accumulated heat of the day, belonging to no one, seen by everyone, noticed by almost no one. Which is, perhaps, the only kind of place where the invisible can safely keep their secrets. And their truths.